Words to the Wise, A Practical Guide to the Esoteric Sciences by Manly P. Hall. Chapter 3, Choosing a Mystical School. There are many different schools of mysticism and occultism in the world. How can a student discover with certainty the system best suited to his individual needs? Philosophic religion has existed among men from the earliest recorded periods. No age has been without a spiritual revelation sufficient to its needs. No race has been left godless, and no nation has risen to power without religious institutions flourishing in its midst. The religious instinct is one of those fundamental impulses which all men share together, and the history of religion is in substance the history of civilization itself. Nor have the fundamental principles of religious life and purpose been greatly modified by the passing of centuries. True, the more barbarous practices of savage peoples have been modified by the cultural impulses that have developed in the race, but the essential values of the religious factor in individual and collective existence remain practically unchanged. The theories of religion in vogue today are the same theories that govern spiritual institutions of the ancient world. Therefore, we may properly interpret the needs of the modern truth seeker in the light of those codes and principles which have survived the vicissitudes of the countless ages. Certain facts have been justified by the experiences of ages. Chief of these facts is the inevitable inequality which exists in the reasoning capacities of men. There has never been a time in recorded history when the inhabitants of even one community were all of equal spiritual achievement. The several races which together inhabit the earth constitute an innumerable inequality of abilities. The social systems that exist within races or form parts of nations and communities are themselves divided into numerous strata according to the mental, spiritual, and physical differences present throughout humanity. In all times, then, and among all peoples, there are few capable of great perfection of thought and action, and the vast majority is lacking in the capacity for exact and inspired thinking. It has always been necessary, therefore, to consider these inequalities when founding or promulgating a religious doctrine. This condition, beyond immediate remedy by man, has forced religious and philosophical systems to grade their teachings, presenting only the simplest parts of their doctrines to those of immature intellect, and reserving the most profound of their wisdom for the discerning and qualified few. If we realize with St. Paul that all men are not equally qualified to receive those esoteric traditions which are the very soul and substance of religion, we can understand the origin of the numerous cults that must inevitably spring up to serve the spiritual needs of a greatly diversified humankind. There must be milk for babes and meat for men. There must be simple revelations suitable to minister to the needs of the spiritual peasantry, and more complicated and profound traditions to satisfy the mature thinking of enlightened persons. There is no evil in a diversity of cults. The evil arises from the failure of these cults to realize that they're all part of one spiritual program. There has never been but one religion among men, but this religion, which Muhammad called the natural faith of mankind, has been variously interpreted by various people in various ages. In recent times, these various interpretations have lost the realization of their final identity and have come to regard themselves as superior and distinct revelations. From this era has arisen the competitive theory which has unfortunately permeated most of the religious institutions of the earth. The result has been a confusion of tongues and the phenomenon of hundreds, yes, thousands of religious sects and isms laboring under the delusion of differences, each claiming superiority over the other and attempting to discredit the tenets of all cults save its own. The enlightened student of metaphysics who has come to realize the fundamental unity of all life and purpose is not to be deceived by the contention of factions, but recognizes all the faiths of man as fragments of a universal religion that is part of the very existence of all living things. Freed, therefore, from an unphilosophical addiction to creeds and dogmas, the honest and earnest seeker after the spiritual truths of life can examine dispassionately all beliefs and can claim as his own the good that he finds in each. Thus we may pass over the issue of religious authority and with an enlightened tolerance towards the beliefs of all men examine the second factor in our problem. The greatest religious systems of the ancient world, which have descended to us as the basis of our present beliefs, were greatly influenced by the factors of race and geography. Race determined the profundity of the revelation, and geography influenced its symbolism and interpretation. Races are the rung levels on the ladder of evolution, and each race is divided into subraces, which represents quality levels within the racial structure itself. No two types of clans or communities in the world today are on precisely the same level of evolution. Each of the material divisions of the social system represents a level of unfolding consciousness and furnishes an environment for the attainment of certain vital experiences necessary to the final perfection of man. It naturally follows that souls evolving in each of these levels must have a spiritual interpretation of life suitable to the experiences of the levels. This is one of the reasons why missionary activities are so generally unsuccessful. It is profitless, yes, finally impossible, to convert any man to a spiritual code beyond his awareness or inconsistent with his present cycle of experiences. Missions have therefore succeeded where they ministered to health or carried on educational work, but when they seek to deflect the individual from the course of his own consciousness, they accomplish more harm than good. Each of the great racial divisions of mankind received at its inception an interpretation of religion consistent with the purpose of the racial consciousness. These revelations were all derived from the same ancient and ageless source that we may call, for practical purposes, the wisdom religion of the world. Not only did each race receive its own tradition, but each race, as it unfolded, developed and specialized its tradition until the racial faiths took on distinct individualities. It is these individualities now, for the most part crystallized and inflexible, that we know as the religious systems of the world. To classify a few of them: Brahmanism. This was the religious system of the primitive Aryans, built up from a tradition that has been individualizing for nearly 1,000,000 years. Brahmanism is the fundamental religious impulse of India and has gradually been broken up into numerous dependent systems such as yoga, Vedanta, and the Tantric philosophy. Confucianism. This is really the comparatively modern crystallization of the ancient traditions of the Atlantean Chinese, reformed and restated by the great philosopher Confucius. Numerous Chinese sects are derived from the fundamental tenets of Confucian authority. Taoism. This philosophy, which has developed in the Chinese racial consciousness, represents one of the migrations of Brahmanic philosophy, thus mingling with Chinese thought this Hindu tradition, ministered to a certain level in the unfolding Mongolian consciousness. Zoroastrianism. Several prophets known by the name Zoroaster rose up to minister to the spiritual needs of the Irano-Aryan migrations. As the Persian civilization rose, the Magian cult of Zoroaster came to power and was finally reformed and restated by Spitama, the last of the Zoroasters, some 600 years before the Christian era. Under the name Mithraic, the Persian cults reached Rome to serve a certain level of Roman thought, and finally the Persian stream mingled with the waters of Christianity. Buddhism. This ancient faith, also arising in India, was one of the first to branch off from the Brahmanic tree. It retained individuality for thousands of years to finally emerge as a great world religion about 500 BC under the leadership of Gautama Buddha. Buddhism broke into several parts, migrated to most of the Eastern nations where its influence has been felt from Ceylon and Java on the south to Tibet and Japan on the north. The Orphic theogony. This philosophic system, also a branch of the Brahmanic tree, developed in the classical civilizations in the Near East, becoming the spiritual power behind the cultural supremacy of the Greeks. Orphic philosophy was revealed by Orpheus, Pythagoras, and Plato, and mingled with the Mithraic in Rome, the Egyptian mysteries in Egypt, and also Christianity. This mingling resulted in Gnosticism and also influenced Jewish metaphysics through the Essene and Nazarene sects. Osiris worship. Also of Eastern origin, this faith was successfully transplanted to Egypt, where it flourished for more than 5,000 years and finally disintegrated with the collapse of Egyptian culture. It continues now only as an impulse in Christian thought. Judaism. Technically speaking, we must accept Judaism as arising among the Egyptian, Chaldean, and other ancient peoples in the Mesopotamian area. Under the leadership of Moses, the great migration of the Jewish nation took place that finally individualized the faith, which has continued to the present time with very few modifications. Christianity. The decadence of the pagan mysteries due to the demoralizing effect of the disintegration of old peoples in the military era inaugurated by Rome necessitated a restatement of the wisdom religion some 2,000 years ago. This restatement, under the name of Christianity, constitutes the spiritual urge behind the development of the European and American culture. Mohammedanism. The last of the great world religions to come into being was the faith of Islam, the strongest branch to come from the tree of primitive Christianity. From the 6th century AD on, Islamism has increased in strength and at the present time represents the most powerful rival to Christianity in the religious world. It has converted most of the Near East and penetrated far into Asia. Curiously enough, some of the earliest of the Brahmanic theological doctrines return as a stranger to their own country in the form of Islamism. In addition to this panorama of religious motion in the world, it is necessary to recognize the numerous cults which have sprung up combining factors from two or more of the great religious movements. These major schools have been subject to innumerable reformations and their doctrines to numerous interpretations and reinterpretations. To the average person of the Western world, Christianity is the familiar example of religious growth. The hundreds of sects that have sprung up in this religion alone are typical of similar divisions existing in other world faiths. Each of these sects claims precedence over the others for accuracy of interpretation and sublimity of purpose. It's not surprising, therefore, that the layman in religious matters, when confronted with the complexity everywhere present in matters of faith, should wonder which way to turn in order to secure spiritual knowledge in its most nearly pure and unadulterated form. But even this picture of existing conditions is not the whole of the story. There's yet a third factor to be considered, and this is the individual truth seeker himself. Although today millions of persons are born together in a great nation like America, they should in no way be regarded as similar in capacity or interest merely because of the circumstances of birth. This country, but a few centuries old, has received into it egos whose previous lives have taken place in numerous other civilizations, and who bring with them religious impulses and spiritual predilections from all the great faiths of the ancient world. 5 sons born into one family may have locked within their subconscious selves the religious convictions of 5 different world religions. These differences are plainly evident to the trained observer and very often have stamped themselves upon the appearance of the individual. Thus, children born of centuries of Anglo-Saxon ancestry may have about them the impression that they have come from some Far Eastern country. Therefore, side by side in any gathering of 100% Americans are souls whose spiritual experiences bind them with the faiths and cultures of the world's most distant places. A man may be born an American and yet be, by spiritual thought and moral code, a Greek, a Brahmin, a Buddhist, or a Mohammedan. In harmony with the consistent course of Western life, all these people may be nominally members of the Christian faith in this present life, but a man, though baptized, a Christian here, remains religiously what his soul is. If in previous lives he has been a Brahmin, he is bound to interpret Christianity in terms of Brahmanic philosophy. A good example of a Western man with an Eastern soul is America's great philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson. When, therefore, a person living in this century, in this civilization, asks the question, "What are my spiritual needs?" it is a large matter to decide this. It is impossible to establish an interpretation of religion that suits the needs of all people, because these people bring with them, out of the deathless past, impulses and attitudes that must be ministered to individually and intelligently. This explains the reason why many faiths and many interpretations flourish together among nearly all progressive peoples. Here, also, is revealed the absurdity of attempting to establish state faiths and creeds or to regiment human religious instincts. This is also the reason why each truth seeker, in his search among faiths for the solution to his problems, finds at last some one belief that more than any other is suitable to his needs. Having thus traced the general course of our problem, we must next examine what may be called the anatomy and physiology of religion. It was customary among the enlightened theologians of antiquity to distinguish grades of interpretation suitable for the numerous classes that exist within any society. From this comes the fashion of dividing all religious instructions into two general parts, exoteric and esoteric. This division was not arbitrarily determined by the priesthood, but arose from a phenomenon evident everywhere in society. The majority of humankind is incapable of understanding, applying, or appreciating the more profound aspects of a philosophical religion. Thus, faiths were simplified to human need. The great body of each religious system consisted principally of moral doctrines, commandments, and injunctions to propriety and honesty. These simple codes regulated the body of society and gave ordinary persons a protective character-building code of life. The Golden Rule became the standard of human relationships in over 40 great faiths, and no man can deny today that this code, if applied, would solve most of the problems of empire. Nor can any man hope to ascend to the higher mysteries of spiritual existence who has not mastered and applied this simple formula of integrity. The majority of humanity neither questions nor inquires beyond the narrow circumference of creature comforts. To live honestly and comfortably and to die with the hope that the future will prove benevolent approximately epitomizes the spiritual problems of the multitude. In fact, many well-educated and informed persons believe that this is all the religious knowledge that any human being needs, and that all the rest is fancy and illusion. There is always, however, a certain class in society not so easily satisfied. These individuals demand a more inclusive and mature religious understanding. They perceive, even though but dimly, that the spiritual problem of life is far greater than merely a moral code. This does not mean that they reject the simple truths of honesty and right living, but rather that, out of ages of evolution, the soul within has come to realize that life is not a material but a spiritual experience. Religion is not merely a part of existence, a series of arbitrary moral codes, religion is the whole of existence. Spiritual facts are the only facts, and the whole material universe is merely a tiny spiritual particle vibrating in a vast, measureless, unknowable sea of spirit. This realization brings with it an irresistible desire to investigate the divine world that surrounds and interprets what we've come to call the material world. This impulse to spiritual investigation comes only to the soul somewhat matured in spiritual values. History records that these truth seekers have existed in every civilization. They have always been the minority as to numbers, but they've been pioneers of progress, and most of the world's advancement in fineness and character has been due to their efforts and their ideals. What we call a truth seeker today is one of this small group who, dissatisfied with the physical existence, even under moral law, desires to explore and understand the worlds of mind and soul and spirit extending beyond the limits of our material perceptions. It was for these more advanced types that the esoteric doctrines of the ancients were evolved, and an inner tradition suitable to the needs of such individuals is present in the structure of every great religion. All faiths have their inner or esoteric schools into which they accept as students those who've outgrown the outer and more evident interpretations of religious knowledge. The Brahmins had their mystery temples at Ellora and Elephanta. The Egyptians had their crypts of initiation under the island of Philae. The Buddhists established their mystery school in the Saptaparna caverns even during the time of Gautama. All the great world religions, though divided by their superficial differences of their exoteric creeds, unite in their esoteric knowledge. It is this secret doctrine, which all the faiths of the world share in common, that interest all sincere students of religion. The quest of essential wisdom is the great work of life. One of the greatest problems in modern mystical philosophy is to free the popular mind from the conceit that a little metaphysical speculation relieves the individual from all responsibility and duties of the temporal state. Self-improvement is one of the first duties of man, for only through ages of self-improvement can we achieve to that state of wisdom we so greatly desire. The practice of mysticism is not a substitute for improvement, nor does it bestow upon us any knowledge or skill in those exact arts and sciences, the mastery of which is necessary to our spiritual security. Some will say that a mastery of martial arts can have little meaning to the spiritual man, for, like other aspects of illusionary existence, these arts must finally be dissipated by the light of perfect reason. It is unquestionably true that all human institutions are so full of ignorance and imperfection that in terms of ultimates, they are of but passing moment. Yet the mastery of these arts and sciences is of greater account than may at first appear. The first merit of learning is discipline, the integrity by which an individual remains faithful to a certain line of effort is itself a vital factor in soul growth. You may well say that they do not speak Greek in heaven, so why should we learn it on earth? The answer to this is that it's not the language as such that is important, but the ability to learn it. The strengthening and specializing of faculties is important. In the same way, we study many things here that are of no use hereafter, but they are necessary here, and excellence in them is a vital factor in our well-being hereafter. To the mystic, material knowledge may seem to be a mass of trifles, but as Michelangelo said, trifles make perfection, and perfection is no trifle. The thousands of experiences of our material existence may seem in themselves insignificant, but together they make up the perfection of action, and this perfection is the foundation of our divine existence. Let all serious thinkers remember that material existence, with its confusions and discords, is part of the divine plan, and being part of the plan is evidently necessary to the creatures who are evolving through it. If we were not supposed to master the physical world, we would not be placed here. Nor does philosophy allow that being here, our first impulse should be to escape. Rather, we should realize that only those who are faithful unto little things shall be made masters over greater things. If we cannot live in this small part of the universe, how can we become citizens of a greater world with vaster and more numerous complexities? As an excuse for lack of knowledge and lack of incentive to learn, a certain class of metaphysicians affirms, upon the authority of the Bible, that if they seek first the kingdom of heaven, all else will be added unto them. Or possibly they will quote the celebrated words, "The Lord is my shepherd, and I shall not want." Let us analyze these two overworked phrases a little more critically. What did the old prophet mean when he said, "Seek ye first the kingdom of heaven"? Did he mean to sit around mumbling platitudes? Do men achieve righteousness by merely affirming their desires or striving to psychologize them into the state of mind that God owes me a living? Is it reasonable to say that the advice of the prophet has been intelligently followed by people whose quest for truth consists of listening to a few talks on divine prosperity? We can scarcely conceive such to be the case. Rather, it would seem that the biblical advice implies the dedication of the life to a quest of truth and the understanding of those spiritual laws which together constitute the kingdom of heaven. Nor is it at all probable that the reward promised was to be regarded as a material remuneration. He who achieves truth achieves all that is real, and truth is its own reward. Truth and real estate are not the same thing, nor is the science which is dedicated to the perfection of the human soul to be confused with those arts and crafts which have as their foundation a system of remuneration suitable for the perpetuation of physical society. As to the opening words of the 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd," this is an affirmation of the fact that the human will acknowledge the supremacy of divine will and follows after truth as the sheep follows the shepherd. The 23rd Psalm is not an economic formula. It is a hymn of praise in which a grateful and enlightened soul pays homage to that sovereign truth which supports it through all the emergencies of life. The psalmist says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," which is equivalent to saying, "I have given myself to the truth. What other thing can I desire?" To interpret the scriptures as signifying that a few months' study of metaphysics entitles the individual to rest forever on the divine bounty is to depart entirely from every sound system of religion or philosophy that has ever existed. Our problem is concerned with religious and philosophical orientation. Each person brings with him into the present life a considerable background in spiritual experience. We are born the sum of what we have previously accomplished. The ideals and codes of action intrinsic to us bear witness to thousands of years of thought and idealism. To discover where we stand in the spiritual life of the universe, it is necessary that we analyze what we believe, for our most secret beliefs and convictions concerning God, nature, and life are the true measure of our soul power. In questing about in life for religious and philosophical systems to inspire and stimulate our present actions, we must naturally align ourselves with such modern institutions as are consistent with the spiritual program we've lived through many lives. It is man's natural instinct to do this that results in the perpetuation of numerous sects and cults, all devoted to the same general program, but differing in minor details of attitude and method. As growth depends upon the intelligent program, the wise person, discovering in himself what he needs, next dedicates his thought to the accomplishment of what is necessary. Mankind lives and learns along the lines of least resistance. In most cases, the line of least resistance is the line of greatest proficiency. We are most familiar with those things which we have most often done. If we have dedicated many lives to the study of a certain philosophy or to the living of a certain code, it is easier for us to continue in that philosophy or code than to branch out into some new or unexplored field of thought or action. Every human being, consciously or unconsciously, lives according to the structure of belief built up within his subjective self through the numerous lives that have preceded his present incarnation. Therefore, it follows that if we can analyze correctly what we believe, we shall discover at the same time what we are, and also the quality of the force that motivates our thoughts and action. We are what we believe. This does not mean that we are greatly influenced by the sectarian attachments of this present incarnation, nor are we to confuse names with truth. In each life, we call our belief something different, but it is the belief itself and not the name we give to it that must be considered if we are to arrive at the facts concerning our spiritual state. The psychologist, probing into the subconscious mind for motives and complexes, realizes the significance of those subtle impulses that seem to come from nowhere, but are really founded upon ages of assimilated experience. Every student of the sacred sciences would do well to make a simple psychoanalysis of his own spiritual background. He can take a valuable step in this direction by quietly examining his innermost convictions concerning certain great realities of life. Each person who has thought at all about abstract matters has arrived at conclusions that are, at least to a certain measure, satisfactory and sufficient to his own needs. Suppose, then, that you sit down quietly and answer the following questions according to your deepest and most complete convictions. Do not derive your answers from some creed in which you are now interested or with which you have affiliated yourself during this life. Write down the answers that come to you out of your heart of hearts, and then examine the answers critically and impersonally, with the realization that you are examining the summary of many lives of hoping, dreaming, and experiencing. Give your most perfect understanding of 1. The nature of God. 2. The nature of nature. 3. The nature of man. 4. The nature of the soul. 5. The nature of universal purpose. 6. The nature of universal ultimate. The way in which each of these is answered will reveal major trends of belief. The great schools of philosophy that have arisen among the empires of antiquity were distinguished from one another principally by the answers they formulated to these 6 questions. In many cases, the differences between the schools were more apparent than real. While a few of those most highly proficient in the doctrines since the universal concord, the laymen of these various religious and philosophical orders were divided by their various opinions, even as is true today among the sects of Christendom. Each of our questions is susceptible of at least 3 answers, and these answers clearly reveal the religious and racial background. The first question, as to the nature of God, must naturally be answered from the viewpoint of the patriarchist, the matriarchist, or the impersonalist. If we bestow upon God masculine or positive attributes, as is common throughout Christendom and Israel, we're patriarchist. This attitude can be refined until the personal elements very largely disappear and our patriarchy becomes an abstract philosophical concept. We see deity in the aspect of father, and all creations appear as the children or progeny of this parent. The Romans, Persians, Chinese, Some of the Greeks, the Nordic peoples, and the Judaistic cults are the backgrounds of the patriarchist idea. Among several mystic cults, we have the worship of deity as mother. In the matriarchal system, the tender, maternal emotions are bestowed upon divinity instead of the sterner masculine virtues. The father punishes his wayward children, but the mother forgives them and intercedes for them. Matriarchy at one time dominated the religions of the Egyptians and is generally accepted by many sects of Orientals, especially the Vedantists. With the development of the more sensitive virtues of mankind, female divinities or Shaktis became more prominent in religious systems. The matriarchy is a more advanced philosophical concept than a patriarchy, to the same degree that compassion and forgiveness are higher impulses than vengeance and retribution. The third, or impersonalistic attitude, views deity as principle alone, entirely too transcendent to be limited by any concept of polarity. God is defined as mind, consciousness, spirit, truth, virtue, law, or even, as in the Socratic philosophies, as undefinable, any effort at definition being regarded as defilement. This attitude is Confucian, Buddhistic, Socratic, and esoterically speaking, Platonic. The other 5 questions are susceptible of similar analysis. Nature was accepted as a god by the Greeks, Hindus, and Chinese, as a lifeless and inert vehicle of manifestation by the exoteric Christians and Jews, and as a demon or adversary opposing the laws of spirit by the Gnostics, some sects of the Egyptians, and the Zoroastrians. Man is regarded as a spiritual emanation of divinity itself by the Zoroastrians, Christians, and Jews. He is regarded as a personification of the principle of universal intellect or the embodiment of divine mind by the philosophers of the classical periods, and as the progeny or child of the earth who must be rescued from inglorious extinction by special dispensations by the Gnostics and several of the religious cults of Northern Asia. This attitude also appears among several of the modern Christian cults. The human soul is derived from the universal soul or life of the world by the Platonists and most of the other schools of Greek philosophy. The soul is confused with God or spirit by the Christians, who bestow upon it a certain substantial fabric of its own. The old esoteric doctrines taught that the soul was the experience body of man, built up from the accumulated wisdom gained by the living. The old Egyptians also concurred with this, for they taught that continuity of consciousness after death resulted in the perfection of the soul body, in which the spirit functioned after the decease of its physical form. The purpose for existence is one of the most important issues of religious disagreement. One school declares the purpose of existence to be the perfection of God, another school, the perfection of man, and a third, the perfection of the world or nature. The Greeks believed that deity achieved its own perfection through the unfoldment of itself in its progeny. Christendom centralizes all its dogma about the premise that the purpose of existence is the salvation of the human soul. There are a number of groups of the millennial type who look forward to the establishment of heaven upon earth and a golden age in which perfection will reign forever in the mundane sphere. Exoterically speaking, the Zoroastrians are representative of this group. Concerning the question of ultimates, one school acknowledges that at the end of effort there is some final state in which all things exist together in the fulfillment of all hope and aspiration. This may be called the ultimate doctrine. Then there are the evolutionists, who posit growth as eternal and hold that all natures are unfolding forever and that throughout an innumerable and limitless eternity there is measureless and limitless unfoldment. This group acknowledges no beginning and no end. The third hypothesis is the absorptionist doctrine, which has always dominated the highest philosophical systems. This is to the effect that evolution or growth is finally consummated by the reabsorption of all finite life into the infinite principle from which it had its beginning. This doctrine is particularly prominent in Buddhism, where nirvana represents the return of all individual existence into its universal cause. Heaven is the end of the ultimist. Growth is the end of the evolutionists, and nirvana is the end of the absorptionists. In addition to these primary questions, there are others which also need to be examined in order to discover the fundamental premises upon which your philosophy of life has been built. One of the most important of these is the matter of sin. If you refuse to acknowledge the existence of sin through a process of positive denial, you're an absolutist. If you believe in the forgiveness of sin through divine intercession, you're an atonist. If you believe in the unreality of sin, you're probably a Buddhist. If you accept the fundamental existence of sin, you're an anthropomorphist. If you regard sin as synonymous with ignorance, to be overcome through the unfoldment of personal integrity, you are then a Platonist and a philosopher. If you believe in the merit of motive over action, you're an idealist. If you believe that action is the measure of motive, you're a realist. If you believe in the virtue of humility, you're a renunciationist. If you believe in the supremacy of willpower over universal law, you've been imbibing the philosophy of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. If you believe in the salvation of special classes or types, your background has been among faiths with a strong sacerdotal class or caste, as among the Brahmins or Egyptians. If you believe in a God apart from nature, you're a theist or deist. If you believe that deity is absorbed in its own creation, ruling it from within through attributes and various media, you're a pantheist. Deism is very strong with the Mohammedans, and pantheism was universal to the Greeks. If you believe that perfection is a state of perfect individualism, and that you, as you, will go on forever to become a god, you're a personalist. If your concept is final identity with and absorption into a greater, all-wise universal principle, you're an impersonalist. Most Western philosophy is personalistic, and most Eastern philosophy is impersonalistic. This is really the main point of difference between the two schools. If you believe in the efficacy of ritualism and hierarchy, you're a ceremonialist. And you've come up through religious systems containing pageantry and elaborate priestcrafts. If your attitude toward religion is one of extreme simplicity, and you regard all outward religious show as vain, then your background has been among faiths devoted to the teachings of the mystic presence or inner communion, and you're an anti-institutionalist. In your quest for knowledge, if you're satisfied with the understanding of the material world, you're a materialist. If you demand a knowledge of the superphysical causes behind form, you're a transcendentalist. If in transcendentalism you desire to understand the universal mystery through the rationale of knowing, you're an occultist. If your insight is based upon inspiration and feeling, you're a mystic. If your conversion is influenced by the senses and their reflexes, you're a psychic. The most prominent of the materialistic groups are the rationalists. The most prominent of the occult groups are the Brahmins. The most familiar of the mystical religions is Christianity, and the most prominent of the psychical sects is spiritualism. Having examined yourself in an effort to discover the fundamental premises upon which your spiritual life is established, it is then possible to determine with some accuracy what is logically the next step in your growth and development. To borrow from the terminology of the Neoplatonist, The purpose of mystical philosophy is participation in divine truths. The material universe is the outer court of wisdom's temple. The courses of life were termed by the initiates sacred processionals, the pageantry of being. Theon of Smyrna, an initiate of the illusion mysteries, in his celebrated treatise on mathematics, compared philosophy to the rites of the sacred mysteries. He explained that there are 5 parts to initiation and 5 parts to philosophy, through the perfection of which mortals elevate their reason to the heroic state. 1,500 years have passed since the decadence of the pagan mysteries, but the laws that bound the neophytes of the illusion mysteries still bind seekers after spiritual knowledge. Theon describes the 5 steps of self-unfoldment as purification, tradition, inspection, instruction, and illumination. It may be well to explain the use of these terms when applied to the steps of human development. By drawing upon the fragments in the writings of Theon, Empedocles, Plato, Proclus, and Olympiodorus, we can prepare an authentic commentary upon the rules of the sacred order. According to Proclus, the perfective part of philosophy must precede initiation. The perfective part includes 2 distinct processes. The first is called purgation and signifies the cleansing of the whole nature of its accumulated evil, both bodily and temperamental. For as Theon says, the mysteries are not communicated to all who are willing to receive them, but only such as possesses a purity of life and purpose resulting from certain disciplines of purification. In the sacred schools, morality is the beginning of wisdom, and all discipleship begins with self-discipline. The second process involves the positive aspect of integrity. Having cleansed the nature of its terrestrial evils and emancipated it from bondage to appetites and instincts, it is then necessary to perfect within the nature a positive standard of right knowledge and right action. Thus, purification is more than merely emptying a life of its old vices. It is the filling of the life with new virtues and the perfecting of an acceptable standard of personal integrity. After the processes of the perfective part of philosophy have been achieved, the second step of self-unfoldment confronts the disciple. This is called tradition, and is defined in the old writings as becoming acquainted with the sacred fables, legends, myths, and rites. We could define it today as intellectual philosophy. The public schools of the present generation teach traditional education, for knowledge passed on from generation to generation is tradition. Tradition is stored in the memory, but is not self-motivated. A man may remember all the traditional knowledge of the race and still be unable to think. The memory is only a small part of the mind. Memory stores up tradition, but cannot use or vitalize it. Tradition becomes valuable to the individual only when it is vitalized by the reason. This involves another problem. A child in school who has great difficulty in learning is often referred to as lacking capacity. No individual can be educated beyond his capacity, for there's an inward measure governing all outward things, knowledge with the rest. Traditional knowledge is in itself dead, literal, and often uninspiring. But all tradition locks vital truths within itself. These can be liberated by thought and meditation. Neophytes preparing to enter the temple of ancient wisdom received the traditions of their order as part of their preparatory rites. Thus they became aware of the dignity and the import of the institution in which they desired to associate themselves. In addition to a general historical outline, the neophytes received elaborate discourses on cosmogony, the story of the universe, anthropology, the story of man, and psychology, the story of the soul. Disciples finished this period of training in tradition with a reasonably complete knowledge of the laws governing heaven, earth, and man. The traditional teachings of the old mysteries are now to be found in the sacred books of the world. These scriptures remain locked, however, until memory is vitalized by personal experience. The third part of initiation is that which is denominated inspection. The neophyte entered the temple at this stage and beheld the initiatory dramas and partook of them. As Plutarch describes in his Isis and Osiris and Apuleius in his Metamorphoses, inspection included participation in certain divine mysteries. No complete record has descended among exoteric writings as to the initiatory rituals. The historian Pausanias in the History of Greece declared that it had been his intention to describe in that work the divine dramas. Even, however, while he was writing the account, one of the gods appeared to him and forbade the recording of the rites. From the brief statement by Apuleius, one fact can be restored. Initiation was consummated by the similitude of death. By their occult arts, the priest induced a trance-like state, suspending all the physical functions of the neophyte. While in this condition, the soul of the candidate, released by magical formulas from its house of clay, experienced temporarily the sublime reality of conscious immortality. As Virgil led Dante through the tortuous passageways of the Inferno, so the Hierophant of the Mysteries led the consciousness of the neophyte through the mysteries of the mundane sphere. This was called inspection because the neophyte viewed as a stranger the universe of wisdom. The same spiritual truth is set forth in the Apocalypse, where the angel or the guide lifts St. John the Seer to the high place and shows him the mysterious city of God. By inspection, then, Theon meant the development of those clairvoyant powers by which the sage perceives the workings of the superphysical worlds in the same way that the ordinary person perceives the workings of the material world. The fourth step is called instruction. Theon thus describes the end and design of this part of initiations, and the fourth, ellipsis, is the binding of the head and fixing of crowns, so that the initiated may, by this means, be enabled to communicate to others the sacred rites in which he has been instructed. Whether after this he becomes a torchbearer or an interpreter of the mysteries, or sustains some part of the sacerdotal office. This part of the ancient initiation was also divisible into two processes, the first of which signified by the binding of the head and fixing of the crown. The Hierophant of the Mysteries was regarded as higher than any material ruler, and of all men, he alone did not bow in the presence of the king. The fixing of the crown and the rituals of the Egyptians represented the achievement of mastery and the consummation of the initiatory processes. Coronation brought the term of candidacy to an end. The stage of adeptship has been reached. Having mastered the lesser things, himself, the new adept, is made master over greater things, becoming a spiritual prince of the universe. The binding of the head represents the encircling of the reasoning faculties with a limiting circumference, a symbol of control or direction. The mind is bound to the purpose of will. The second process of instruction is that by which the new initiate himself becomes a teacher of others, thus paying the debt he incurred during the periods of his own instruction. In ancient times, only those who had achieved to the fourth degree of wisdom were permitted to be teachers of occult philosophy or founders of sacred schools. Such celebrated initiates as Pythagoras and Plato had successfully passed the grade of instruction before their right to establish communities and colleges was recognized by the philosophical hierarchies. It therefore follows that these great philosophers were trained clairvoyants and had actually explored those mysteries of nature of which they spoke and wrote. Theon then adds that those who had successfully passed the grade of inspection could become torchbearers, by which he arcanely signified perpetuators of the ancient truths, or interpreters, by which he meant teachers who might initiate disciples as they had been initiated. Or if they chose, these new initiates might attach themselves to some temple or shrine holding sacerdotal office as the priest of Delphi who served Apollo, or the Aesculapiads who perform healing through magnetism and occult arts in honor of the god Aesculapius. An initiate of the fourth degree received the credentials by which he might enter the inner sanctuary of mystery schools of other nations and peoples than his own. One of the last to receive the fourth rite in the classical civilization was Apollonius of Tyana, who was received with the greatest of dignity by the Brahmin priest of India. The fifth and last part of initiation is illumination. Of this Theon writes, "But the fifth, which is produced from all these, the four preceding steps, is friendship with divinity, and the enjoyment of that felicity which arises from intimate converse with the gods." To the initiate, the gods were not personalities, but states of consciousness, exalted forces moving in space. By intimate converse with the gods, the initiate meant the elevation of consciousness to a realization of universal and divine reality. Only the highest of the initiates attain to this most exalted consciousness, nor can any human being at this stage of his development remain permanently in so transcendent a mood. One of the noblest of all philosophers, Plotinus, whose wisdom was second only to Plato's in its sublimity, was permitted only a few occasions to achieve identity with the universal good. The last words of Plotinus are suitable to one who has gone as far on earth as philosophy can lead a mortal man. "Now I endeavor that my divine part may return to that divine nature which flourishes throughout the universe." The modern application of Theon's outline of initiation may not be at first apparent, but a little thought will reveal its pertinence. The 5 parts of initiation are the 5 natural steps in human improvement which follow sequentially when the student has set up within himself a wisely directed effort toward the perfection of his life and being. The steps of initiation were not arbitrarily decreed by ancient priests. They are levels of consciousness arising from the disciplines of philosophy. The unfoldment of the human soul must conform with certain universal laws inherent in the elements of existence. Growth is progressive obedience. If we would know the secret doctrine, we must set up a certain chemistry within our own natures by the living of the philosophic life. It is because of this fact that we have inherited from the past rules and regulations concerning the conduct and deportment of truth seekers. These rules are points of entrance, and anyone attempting to come into the temple by any other way, the same as a thief and a robber. Cerberus, the 3-headed dog, keeps the gates of the invisible world. Only the ones who conquers the 3 excesses of the animal soul can enter the precincts of the inner life. The golden bough of the mysteries is the symbol of this conquest, and is borne by all who set forth upon the great adventure. The Greeks also symbolized the initiatory procedure under the figure of the Argonautic expedition. The adventures of the 50 heroes led by Jason, like the Odyssey of Homer, arcanely set forth the soul's quest for light. He who would possess the golden fleece, the luminous soul body of the adept, must slay the many-coiled dragons who guard the sacred tree. According to Plato, The blessed theurgist who accomplishes initiation is assimilated to divinity insofar as such assimilation is possible to mankind. Truth seekers of the modern world are divided into 5 grades according to the same order as the prototypes in antiquity. The 2 lower parts of the sacred order, purification and tradition, are generally termed probationary. The 2 higher parts, instruction and illumination, are termed culminative or perfective. And the 5th part, which is in the middle dividing the 2 groups, which the ancients termed inspection, is modernly designated initiation or acceptance into a bona fide school of the mysteries. For all practical purposes, average truth seekers of the modern world belong to the probationary parts of the great work. No one seeking enlightenment can achieve his purpose without first satisfying the law through the purification of his life and the enlightenment and perfection of his reason. It is a great mistake for students of occult philosophy to believe that they can achieve to proficiency in the spiritual sciences without ordering and disciplining thought and action. It is useless for us to regret the disappearance from society of the mystery schools of antiquity. Even if these institutions were still flourishing in our midst, our present standards of thought and action would deny us any right to participate in their benefits. Very few modern students of metaphysics could reasonably hope to be admitted to even the lowest grades of the ancient mystery temples. The real problem that concerns the modern student is not how rapidly he will achieve illumination, but rather how long a time will yet transpire before he puts his foot on the lowest rung of the ladder of preparation. Many students who believe that 20 years of aimless rambling in metaphysics have fitted them for deification must sometime make the sad discovery that there is no haphazard way to truth. It is also sad but true that, to correct an old adage, all roads do not lead to Rome. Only such roads lead to Rome as actually go in that direction, popular belief notwithstanding. No disciple of sacred doctrines, no matter how genial or willing or optimistic or generally kind-hearted, can expect any results whatsoever from his efforts until he overcomes intemperance and ignorance within himself. Self-discipline is the beginning of philosophy, and no one who has not given years to the exact science of self-discipline has any right to claim for himself any distinction in metaphysical matters. It is useless to attempt the development of spiritual faculties while the mind, emotions, and the body are without coordination or intelligent and sufficient direction. All the great philosophical religions of the world are in complete accord on this point. There is not one exception to this rule. In any nation, among any people at any time, admission to sacred order was possible only to those who had first accomplished the mastery of self. It is a sad, yes, tragic state of affairs which confronts the modern truth seeker. He's been deceived into the erroneous belief that the kingdom of heaven will open its gates to persons who bring no gifts but their own moral and intellectual deformities. The first duty of those who would be wise is to render temperate all the intemperances of the moral nature. We are creatures of excesses, the tranquility of the soul constantly destroyed by the inconsistencies of the attitudes. Philosophy is moderation, and all philosophers must be moderate. If we would achieve to truth, we must sacrifice our intemperances upon the altar of our high resolve. Eminent spiritual achievement is impossible to the millions of human beings whose inner tranquility is constantly shattered by the warring of their notions, opinions, and attitudes. As Cicero has so beautifully observed, the wise man is modest in success, patient in adversity, and at peace with all things. At the present rate of progress, it will be about 50 incarnations before many enthusiastic metaphysicians are at peace with anything. Yet this is only the first half of the first step towards enlightenment. A man ascends to the heights of wisdom not upon the broad pinions of enthusiasm, but by the slow and arduous course of merit. Having rescued the nature from the harpies of intemperance, it is next necessary to rescue the soul from that general ignorance which limits all action and denies direction to effort. To overcome ignorance in even the most ordinary matters is by no means an easy task, for man is but a small area of capacity immersed in an infinite expanse of the unknown. Plato recommended mastery in 5 sciences as reformative. He suggested arithmetic, geometry, stereometry, music, and astronomy as good remedies for that stupidity which is a falling sickness of the soul. I fear that such a program will prove discouraging to many people who, knowing little, if anything, about anything, feel themselves on the verge of cosmic consciousness. The purpose of the disciplines set forth by Plato is not that man shall accomplish knowledge through them, but rather that by the exercising of disciplines man is capable of interpreting the knowledge that is locked within his own spiritual nature. If knowledge is to be released in action, then the vehicle or personality of man must be trained to interpret the light of God within himself. Inward truth can reveal itself only when the outward nature is balanced and informed. The first part of initiation is therefore accomplished when the individual becomes of sound judgment and is well-rounded in mental attitude and well disciplined in emotional and physical action in all matters pertaining to material life. Having accomplished this, the disciple is then ready for the second step, or that part which the ancients call tradition. The modern truth seeker accomplishes the traditional end of his instruction best by acquainting himself through reading and thinking with the whole theory of philosophical institutions. In an earlier chapter, we listed a number of books suitable for such reading. Study follows purification because through the balancing and perfecting of the nature, an inner relaxation is achieved, which increases the merit and integrity of mental effort. It will generally take about 5 years of intelligent and well-planned study to become reasonably well acquainted with the fundamental premises of the ancient wisdom teaching. When this course of study is well rounded out and is built into a disposition already refined through consecrated effort, a spiritual chemistry results in the system. The 2 parts of initiation, purification and instruction, then work together, and out of the combination arises a high degree of inspiration. The student becomes more and more spiritually conscious. It will usually require several lives to exhaust the opportunities of these first 2 steps in spiritual progress. It is only after this foundation has been thoroughly established and conscientiously perfected that an intelligent truth seeker permits himself to contemplate initiation into the great school.